Good morning. This is Sean Spence with Let's Talk Poverty News, your United States poverty and homelessness headlines. A major new study tells us why homelessness spikes and what actually stops it. A landmark study published this week in the journal JAMA Network Open is changing the conversation about what drives homelessness in America. Researchers from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and UCLA spent 5 years analyzing data across all 50 states and the District of Columbia, and what they found is striking. Between January 2020 and January 2024, homelessness nationwide rose by 33%, reaching the equivalent of 1 in every 435 Americans. But that rise was not uniform. Some states saw modest changes, while others experienced dramatic jumps. The researchers wanted to understand why. Their answer is clear. The study found that eviction moratoria substantially reduced increases in homelessness during and after the pandemic, while displacement due to property damage from disasters such as floods, fires, and storms accelerated them. The senior author, Dr. Craig Pollack of Johns Hopkins, put it plainly. Discussions about homelessness often focus on economic factors like rents and unemployment. Those factors matter for overall levels of homelessness, but sudden increases are much more strongly tied to acute events, especially evictions and climate-related housing losses. The researchers estimate that without eviction moratoria, the average state increase in homelessness between 2020 and 2022 would have nearly doubled. And without disaster-related housing destruction, that increase would have been closer to 8% instead of 11%. The message here is not abstract. When communities protect people from sudden displacement, whether from a landlord or a flood, fewer people end up on the street. That is a policy choice, and this study gives us the data to make it. Food assistance cuts are arriving in communities right now. Over the past year, enrollment in the Federal Nutrition Assistance Program known as SNAP has declined by approximately 3.3 million people. And according to advocates, that number is not a neutral correction. It is the result of deliberate policy changes now taking effect across the country. New rules affecting non-citizen eligibility began taking effect on April 1st, with changes applied at each recipient's next redetermination. Meanwhile, new work requirements are being enforced more broadly than at any previous point in the program's history. Roughly 4 million Americans are expected to lose SNAP benefits in 2026 under the legislation passed last year. Many of them do not meet the expanded work requirements now attached to the program. Under the new policy, childless adults, whose upper age limit has now been extended to 64, can be exempt from work requirements only in areas with at least 10% unemployment. That is a threshold most communities do not come close to reaching. Nearly 40% of SNAP participants are children, 20% are older adults, and 10% are individuals with disabilities. Nearly 3/4 of SNAP households have gross monthly incomes at or below the federal poverty line. For these families, food assistance is not a supplement, it is a foundation. When it disappears, the ripple effects reach children, caregivers, local grocery stores, and the broader community economy. The full impact of these changes is still unfolding, but for the millions of Americans already navigating the edges of poverty, the changes are not coming, they are here. New research confirms what works and what we risk losing. The consequences of declining food assistance extends far beyond individual households. Research consistently shows that nutrition programs reduce food insecurity, improve child development, lower health care costs, and lift people out of poverty. And this week, a separate analysis from the Food Research and Action Center reinforced that the design of current policy changes appears to be steering away from what the evidence supports. SNAP is designed to be countercyclical, meaning that as the economy worsens, enrollment increases. Extensive evidence shows that it reduces food insecurity, lifts families out of poverty, lowers health care costs, and boosts local economies. Every dollar distributed through SNAP generates approximately $1.50 to $1.80 in economic activity. The research is not partisan. It is consistent, longitudinal, and documented across decades of study. The question in front of communities right now is whether programs with that track record will have the resources to keep doing what the data shows they do. What listeners can do: connect families in your community to local food banks and legal aid organizations that are helping people navigate the new enrollment requirements. Information and navigation matter enormously right now. Headline: 100,000 people housed and a state that proves it can be done. We close this week with a story worth celebrating and worth studying. Building on a 9% reduction in unsheltered homelessness in 2025, the first drop in 15 years, California this week announced $145.4 million in new funding to help 8 additional regions across the state get people off the streets and into housing and services. The program behind this progress, the Homelessness Housing Assistance and Prevention Initiative, has already transitioned more than 100,000 Californians from homelessness into permanent stable housing. 100,000 people with real keys to real homes. In the 8 communities receiving funding this week, 80% of awarded budgets is dedicated directly to permanent and interim housing. That is not overhead. That is not administration. That is housing. Researchers, practitioners, and community leaders across this country have spent decades documenting what works. Permanent supportive housing works. Eviction prevention works. Connecting people quickly to stable homes before crises compound works. What California is demonstrating at scale this week is that a government willing to invest in evidence-based approaches, hold grantees accountable for results, and measure progress honestly can move the needle. 100,000 people. That is the number. And behind every one of them is a story that did not have to end in a shelter or on a street. That is what it looks like when we decide to solve this. That's our news edition for the week of April 7th through April 12th, 2026. Thank you for listening to Let's Talk Poverty. Share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. I am Sean Spence. Learn more at povertyactivist.com. Together, we can solve poverty.